One thing that's fun about painting these figures, I really tried to squint at them and think about what are the shapes that kind of define them and keeping them as loose as I can. When it starts to look like a person, I step away and try to leave it pretty minimal. I recently returned from a trip to Sicily, and I had the great opportunity to visit a beautiful old village named Cefalù. I was able to paint on site. I also took a lot of photos, and today I'm going to show you step by step how I painted one of those scenes. Here is a look at the drawing that I created from this scene. There was a lot of information in the reference photo, and I cropped in to find an attractive area to paint. So here I'm dampening down the back of my paper and the front. This is going to allow me more time to paint wet into wet in the scene before the paper dries. I can take my time throughout the first wash of the scene and work in any little bits of color, and I can work while the paper is still damp, which creates some lovely soft blending effects. It's time to lay in the lightest values for the entire scene. Now in watercolor, we're painting from light to dark. So in each phase of the painting, I want to think about what is the brightest area. What areas do I want to paint in order to leave behind in my next wash? So here I'm starting out first with the sky. I'm using a little bit of raw sienna and lavender for the cloud color. And once that is in place, I can come in with some blue to paint around those clouds. Now, when it comes down to this hill in the distance, this is not the final value for the hill. I want to lay in some of the light green earth tones for the hill that I might leave behind in my next wash. And the reason that is because the value of the hill and the value of the sky are very different from each other. The sky is a lot lighter. So I know that when I come back in next time, I'll need to paint even stronger to get that value of the hill to the right amount. When I come down to where these buildings are in the distant hill, I'm going to use some more lavender and a little bit of raw sienna. I don't want to leave the buildings just the white of the paper. I want to tone them down. So I'm leaving a little bit of this lighter color here that I will paint around to define the buildings in the next wash. And as I come down to where the beach is, I'm mixing in a little bit more raw sienna. And now I'll need to mix in some of the blue of the water. And for this first wash of blue, I'm using Cobalt Blue and some Cerulean. I load up my brush and I come up here to where I can work from that wet edge of what I've just painted in for the hill. Now, something to keep in mind, these figures are going to be a lot darker later on in the painting process. So now I can just paint right through them. I don't need to paint around them and get really, really cautious. I know that either I'm going to paint them darker over the top, or if I need a little bit of highlight, I can always scratch in a little highlight or use a little bit of gouache to get to that brighter light color. Now I'm painting up to the edge of this wall. I'm going to come back and paint that in a minute, but right now I'm continuing this wash down to the shoreline. And you'll notice I mixed in a little bit of the green of the hill. I'm using a little bit of burnt sienna and some other colors just to add some variation into the color of the water. And I went ahead and took away the white of the paper for the side of the wall. I added a little bit of raw sienna, some raw umber to give a more more tan color there. Here I'm using more raw sienna, and I'm just kind of taking away the white of the paper and letting those colors blend together. I laid in a little bit of blue for the boat. So there I used a little bit of cerulean and a little bit of lavender, again, to take away the white of the paper and get those light values where they need to be. Now, I'm going to use more raw sienna and lavender to mix up the light color for the sand on the beach. And I went around the bit of this boat. I used a little bit of cerulean, more of this kind of blue, just stronger, some cerulean and lavender mixed in there, and letting that blend right in to this sand color I mixed. So I've taken away the rest of the white of the paper there. Over here, I'm going to add in a little bit different color for the blanket that's on the beach. It's more of that cooler color, and that is lavender and cerulean that I'm using. And I also mixed up a little bit of skin tone for these figures here that are closer. And for that, I'll be using raw sienna and rose madder permanent. And I drop in some of that and let it fuzz in with this first wash. I used a little bit of burnt sienna and raw sienna down here. And that is what my paper looks like after I've painted the first wash of the scene. So I was primarily concerned with all the light in the scene, the bit of blue up in the sky, the little suggestion of clouds, the area down here of the walkway and the sand and all of those areas. A lot of the hill and the water will be gone. I will paint over those again in the next wash. So let's go ahead and take a look at my second wash, which includes the middle values. After that first wash, I let everything dry completely, and now I'm ready to paint the final value for that distant hill. For this color, I'm using some Cobalt Turquoise mixed with a little bit of raw Umber and Cobalt Blue to cool that down. I don't want to use my most vibrant greens when I'm painting the distant hill. As I work my way down, I'll add a little bit more raw sienna and Cobalt Turquoise into that mixture of green to make it a little more warm and saturated. So I'm working my way down the hill. Now, when I get down to where the buildings are, that's where I need to kind of paint around them. So I can slow down, take my time, think about the bits of the buildings that I want to leave behind from the first wash. That's why it's important to draw strong enough with your drawing so that you still have some guidance when you are painting your second wash. This is one thing I really like about painting, is just creating a suggestion of the buildings and all the information that's back there. And it's really fun to think more abstractly, to paint around certain shapes, leave things behind, add a little bit of darks and suggested detail for the background. What I don't want to do is paint a ton of information back here that really captures the attention of the viewer. I want to suggest that bit of information that's in the distance, but I don't want a ton of information and contrast and hard edges. I really want to do my best to create an impression of the distance especially. I want the main area of attention to be down here in the middle ground when I get to the end of the painting. So this was a good mix of raw sienna, Cobalt Turquoise, and then now I've added some neutral tint. I'm adding more pigment, little bits of darks around some of those lighter areas to complete that impression of the distance. Now I'm looking at the darker bit on the water. You can see in the reference photo there's some of the water that's darker over the top of the lighter colors underneath, and that's what I'm trying to paint now, is really see that as one shape, use the texture of the paper to leave some broken marks, and that shape will really help the light stand out on this wall. So that is the texture over the water. And I'm leaving more of that lighter wash as I get down here, closer to the shore. I want to go ahead and connect that middle value right into the side of the wall. I know that that is similar in value, and I want to connect that shape. So here, I'm using some more raw sienna, a little bit of Cobalt Blue, and some neutral tint, and I've just connected that in to the wall. Now I'm going to connect the reflections into that value of the wall as well. So this wall is creating reflections down in the water. While that is damp, I want to go ahead and bring that down, and I'm negatively painting around some of the rocks. I'm looking at that brighter area and leaving some of that information behind. Also painting around this figure. The figure is a nice connection between the beach and the darker bits of the reflections here in the water. And by painting around that figure, I can really help it to stand out, creating some contrast and some interest down here in this area of the scene. Now I tied in some of the reflections into the part of the sand that's more wet here. leaving behind some of what I painted in that first wash. I don't want to completely lose that feeling of light there. And then tying this back in around into some of the different shapes on the sand, the little subtle value differences there. I tied in some of that texture on the sand into this wash. Now I'm going to pay attention to what's going on here in the foreground. There's a little bit of grass and things around this boat that will help it stick out. You'll notice in the reference photo, there were other things down here too. I eliminated a lot of those other things and just decided to leave this nice flipped over old boat here. But I want to create some texture that will help the light stand out on this boat. So I'm using some raw sienna, some cobalt turquoise, a little bit of raw umber, and creating some broken marks to suggest the grass that's growing around here. I tied that into the back of the boat, and now you can see there's some gaps in the wood on this old boat. I'm just trying to drag those in and connect that in to the back of the boat here. That's what the foreground looks like for now. Now I'm going to get into a little bit of the detail work. Some of the figures, I'm going through and adding some more skin tone onto them and bringing more of a feeling of finish. Grounding the figure to the ground using the underside of the blanket and some of the middle value that we see on the bag and other things, just to fill out the rest of the values here in this with these two figures. I used a little more skin tone, some raw sienna, some rose madder permanent. And one thing that's fun about painting these figures, I really tried to squint at them and think about what are the shapes that kind of define them. Without getting too involved in the detail, I'm trying to look at them abstractly and just drop in the light values first, the middle values, and some of the darks, and keeping them as loose as I can. When it starts to look like a person, and I feel like there's a good range of values between the lights, middle tones, and darks, then I step away and try to leave it pretty minimal. I added in the legs on this figure, a little bit of dark for her hair. Now I'm thinking about this figure, a little bit of dark there for her hair. And the scene really starts to come to life once we get some of these figures into place. Now I'm adding in the benches up here and a few figures sitting on those benches. I moved this light pole over into the scene. It was kind of off to the right, and I originally had it cropped out, but I wanted to create a vertical that connects the middle ground through to the background. So that was useful, and I went ahead and included that there. I'm putting some railings and a little more dark and details here in this part of the scene, and adding those figures sitting up on the bench. I needed a few more darks here on the boat close up. A few more darks in the grass to finish up the foreground. And I decided that I wanted to add another wash of blue over the boat to give it a little more value. And I added a few little details for towels and things on the beach here. That was nice to give it a little bit more color. A few more little details on the benches and figures, making sure I have the right amount of darks in. And I feel like with that, the painting is reading a lot better. Now here's a small change that I do. These buildings in the background, I think they look fine. What I decided to do was take a little bit of burnt sienna and raw sienna and just do a little glaze over the top of some of the roofs to give it a little bit of color. It's fairly subtle, but I think it does make a difference, and it draws some attention back there. And again, gives the scene a little more color into what is a little bit of a gray day here. Now, this painting is probably 95% done, but what I noticed is I wanted a little sparkle of light on some of the figures. What I decided to do was use an X-Acto knife. It can be very precise for small little highlights. The only thing that you need to be mindful of, anything you do with an X-Acto knife is permanent. So if you're more comfortable with gouache to get highlights, I think that's fine. But sometimes I like using the X-Acto knife. I can get in really nice and close, and it has a nice look to it, but I felt like I just needed a few little highlights on some of the figures and around the scene. That is a look at the finished painting. I hope that you enjoyed that look into my process. I was really excited to visit this beautiful part of Sicily. It was a great experience, and I hope that some of that comes through in this painting that I showed you today. Next week, I'm going to talk about 5 common mistakes I see that watercolor artists are making and solutions to fix them. So if you're not already subscribed, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. I come out with a brand new video every single Monday. If you have questions about the way that I paint or some of the things I talked about today, take a look at this free resource. Have you ever been really excited about a painting and you get all set up, you find that right reference that you're excited about, and then it's time to go and you feel lost? I have a free resource that I want to give to you today that can help with these problems. My 5 steps to plan a successful watercolor painting. I walk you through the crucial planning phase of your painting that will help you understand what you're going to paint first, second, and third. The planning is really so important, especially in watercolor. This medium is harder to correct. It's so immediate. So having that plan is very important. I send you a PDF that you can download. And the great thing about this is you can have it on your phone. You could print it out. You can download this right now before you start your next painting. All you have to do is follow this link here and download my 5-step guide to planning a successful watercolor painting.